Everyone, Public here, and today I'm bringing you the patch 9.1 survival guide for Shadow Priest. This is meant to be kind of a bird's eye video guide version to help you be prepared for all things Shadow Priest in this new patch. So after balancing and all other changes kind of subside in the coming weeks, I will make kind of a dedicated guide series like I did last time, similar to the kind of opening patch of Shadowlands. Until then, we have this video, which is going to give you that kind of brief overview of everything that you absolutely need to know. And the written guide on Icy Veins and all the resources pinned in the Priest Discord should get you your kind of, most up-to-date information to kind of tide you over until things kind of slow down, solidify, and we can make those final videos. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first things first, if you didn't see, we're going to go over just quickly the changes that are coming to Shadow Priest in 9.1. Overall, like for the most part, this isn't really changing a whole lot for us. What is changing is the new things that we have access to, is the big differences. So kind of run through this list. You should see the brief overview here. So Devouring Plague nerfed by about 18%. Easily this is the hardest hitting nerf that we had, but as a lot of people can tell you, Shadow Priest was already doing well on single target, if not better than lots of other classes, maybe too good. So this nerf definitely helps bring that in line. I do want to note here with this change, this also effectively nerfs the Mind Devourer conduit, basically meaning that the Mind Devourer proc is now slightly less valuable, so there is that. You'll kind of see more on that in a second. To compensate, though, for that Devouring Plague nerf, they did buff both Shadowward Pan and Vampiric Touch by 25%. So from a single target perspective, all things considered, you're looking at about a 4% nerf single target upwards. When we get to multi-target, however, it does start to slow down a little bit, even becoming slightly a DPS increase depending on how many targets you have because of that compensating change. So what they're doing here is simply lowering single target by a bit, giving us a bit to kind of come back with that out with a multi-target perspective. It's really kind of a light touch change. I know the numbers seem a little bit big. In reality, not really changing too much for us. Now, along with these nerfs that I am including in these percentages of overall differences, they also nerf Shadowflame Prism and Talbodar's Stratagem. Talbodar's Stratagem, I don't really understand why it got nerfed. Shadowflame Prism, again, was only nerfed slightly in the grand scheme of things. We'll talk about Legendaries here in just a second. Now, speaking of those Legendaries, we did get access to 4 new Covenant Legendaries, 1 for each Covenant that you could choose. TLDR with these guys, the Necrolord one, which is Pallid Command, pretty strong. You'll see that in a second. The Kyrian one, Sphere's Harmony, is okay. I'd say very situationally good, which is interesting. The Venthyr one and Knife ones are currently not worth crafting for any situation. We can't really find why you would want to do this over Shadowflame Prism in any scenario. But, there they are. Also, we did get Distant Echoes and the Clear Mind Conduits both nerfed. From a conduit perspective, this doesn't really affect anything in terms of rankings or slotting. Just be aware that those things did get nerfed. So these are all the changes for 9.1. Again, very kind of surface level touching, nothing big here from an interaction perspective, which is usually good. So that's all the changes we have so far. So let's kind of dive right into the thing that I'm getting asked the most, which is the Covenant choice for patch 9.1. Okay, with several new Soulbind traits and Covenant-specific Legendaries, our Covenant choice has been shaken up slightly. In the grand scheme of kind of max renown sims, the Covenants actually look closer together now than they ever have from that perspective. That being said, Sim DPS is not and should not be your only factor when choosing a Covenant. Abilities like Soul Shape and Door of Shadows have incredible value in Sanctum of Domination and just in general kind of PvE raid progression. Obviously, cooldown reduction from Fate Guardians is almost universally useful in progression due to the nature of kind of fluctuating fight times. Neither of these scenarios are really possible to sim in kind of like a black box scenario versus other things in the game. So these all kind of play together as, while they are close together from a sim DPS perspective, this is their kind of best case scenario perspective. So, keep that in mind. So the short of it is choosing Night Fae is likely going to be your safest choice from a progression raid perspective or generic Mythic Plus Covenant. Outside of that, at max round when you get access to Plague Deviser Marvelous Kevin's Oozling trait, the single target damage of Necrolord can actually start beating out Night Fae, and that's with Pallid Command specifically. And this is really funny. Again, when I'm talking about beating Night Fae, this is in that Sim DPS black box scenario. We're talking about 100 to 200 DPS. That's what Necrolord is kind of inching ahead of Night Fae. So really the question comes down to, when you're in a max renown scenario, which again, we're not going to be there for still several weeks by the time this video comes out. You need somewhere in the kind of mid 50s of renown to get here, when we're still not quite sure when that's going to happen. that's when this decision starts to come in. And with this Pallid Command legendary, I know I haven't talked about it too much. You know, it's really dependent on the pet AI more so than the rest of our build. So yes, Shadowflame Prism is also somewhat pet dependent, but Pallid Command is effectively giving you another pet in addition to Shadow Fiend, and you also have Kevin's Oozling pet on top of that. Obviously, pets can be kind of wishy-washy. So really the question is, from your perspective, is it worth giving up Soul Shape and that dynamic cooldown reduction for 1 to 2% more single target damage? Some of you will say yes. Some of you will also be like, I just don't want to be Night Fae anymore. Other of you will be like, I really like Necrolord. And this is basically me telling you, you can get a rank 1 parse as Necrolord. It's very possible. Now that being said, Night Fae I think probably gives you the best outcomes from like a generic fight perspective to do well, both from a parse perspective and a progression perspective. Not only because of Soul Shape and all the movement mechanics in the new raid, but also just the nature of dynamic cooldown reduction. So keep that in mind. I think between Night Fae and Necrolord are both very, very strong choices, and I don't think you could go wrong with picking either of them right now by any means. Now, outside of these two choices, I do want you guys to feel free to also pick Kyrian or even Venthyr if you're not like trying to get rank 1 parses necessarily, or you know, if you're not in limit, right? Like you should feel okay to pick Kyrian or Venthyr. Both of them can be very strong in PvE. They're not Night Fae, they're not Necrolord, right? They're going to be slightly lagging behind from an overall DPS perspective, in addition to the utility that they provide. So Kyrian specifically has some monster soulbind abilities with a max renown Forge Light Prime Mechanicos that also pairs well with Kyrian's kind of great single target damage kit, which is great. So again, the problem though with Kyrian is outside of those single target situations, things start to get a little bit shaky. You do have the Sphere's Harmony legendary, which could kind of give you more options for things, but it's not a make or break legendary for the spec. Now, Venthyr is a bit more of a toss-up in terms of legendary choices. The other three that I mentioned I think are all, generally good choices. Venthyr starts to waffle a little bit, and again, I've been Venthyr the whole expansion, so this is coming from someone very personal level. All of the strength in Venthyr right now is currently inside of Theotar, specifically inside of his Party Favors and Soothing Shade traits. Because of that, if there's a fight where you can't use Soothing Shade effectively, the Covenant then becomes much more behind. And we're talking, double or triple the value behind that I mentioned before, that kind of 1 to 2% shift. So this is kind of the core problem with the spec is if there's a fight that has a lot of movement, which I'll let you know a secret is most of Sanctum Domination has lots of movement mechanics that are, easy to deal with, but they do move you out of, theoretically, that Soothing Shade. It's going to be kind of a problem. Party Favors, also pretty RNG. The traits in general are RNG, which basically means on a progression fight, your damage might not be as consistent as it would be with any of the other Covenants. So for me and my perspective, this was enough of a reason for me to swap off of Venthyr. I have gone Night Fae now, purely because I don't want to hinder my raid from a progression perspective. I didn't feel like I was hindering my raid in the opening patch of Shadowlands. I actually feel like that's gotten worse now. So do keep that in mind. Again, I think Venthyr can be good. It's just a question of, do you want to deal with Soothing Shade RNG inside of the new raid? That's really the big question. But again, outside of that, I think Night Fae, Necrolord, those, either one, I think you'll be fine. I don't think there is a choice or the correct choice. I think you could do well with either of those two. And again, Kyrian or Venthyr as wildcard choices if you'd like that. So be sure to check out the Icing Vein guides for full kind of soul binds for each of the Covenants, depending on what situation you want. So, Necrolord rating soul binds, Necrolord Mythic Plus soul binds. I have that for every Covenant, depending on whatever choice that you've made. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Legendaries real quick. Okay, so as for Legendaries, things actually get a little simpler due to the extra potency slot that we're getting access to with enough renown. A lot of you guys probably already have them for your third soulbind. I believe next week you'll get it for your first or second. I don't know, it's in kind of a weird order. But in general, every soulbind is getting access to a new potency soul conduit slot, which means you can fill it with a new potency conduit if you so choose. So for the most part, this is really kind of the tipping point for our legendary decision. I know before now we were kind of like, okay, mostly Shadowflame Prism, sometimes Talbot Stratagem for those single target situations as non-Night Fae. That has changed a little bit just because of this choice. So in reality, we're looking at either choosing Rabid Shadows for that third slot or Mind Devourer. So and really honestly, the difference is Rabid Shadows is significantly ahead of Mind Devourer when you're talking about a situation with Shadow Flame Prism and Mindbender. I think it's like a whole percent, maybe even 2% higher than Mind Devourer with Talbotars. And because of that, you're going to see Shadow Flame Prism across the board for the most part. So, barring any other situations, which we'll get into in just a second, you're going to be using Shadow Flame Prism for effectively everything. There really is no kind of caveats there for most covenants. So again, if you're Night Fae, if you're Venthyr, you're going to be running Shadow Flame Prism all the time, full stop, with Rabid Shadows as your third conduit. That's your goal. Now, the caveats here for Necrolord and Kyrian exist because of one, Pallid Command for Necrolords. They don't get any benefit from Rabid Shadows as much because they're not running Mindbender for that Pallid Command build. They are instead running Void Torrent with that Legendary specifically. And as such, you would choose Mind Devourer for that third slot as Necrolord with Pallid Command. Now, if you're a Necrolord, you're still going to rocking Shadow Flame Prism until you get Pallid Command. You would use Rabid Shadows in the meantime, so keep that in mind. And again, same thing would hold true with generic other legendaries. You would use Mind Devourer as a Necrolord, or again, any other covenant. If you want to use Talbotars or Twins or something like that, you would still pop in Mind Devourer instead. The last caveat with all of that is Kyrian. Now, if you're a Kyrian, you also get access to the Courageous Ascension Soulbind. Effectively, it just means your Covenant ability does 50% more damage-ish. I forget the exact number, which is very strong, and it's strong enough to topple Mind Devourer in this case. So if you're Kyrian, third slot is Courageous Ascension. If you're running Pallid Command or non-Shadow Flame Prism for any other covenant, you run Mind Devourer, Rabid Shadows with Shadow Flame Prism. That's your kind of generic guide. Now, again, like I mentioned, due to this power gain, you're going to be using Shadow Flame Prism most of the time. Now, when you should not use Shadow Flame Prism is primarily just two cases. The first one being Kyrian single target. You will use Talbotar's Stratagem still, and specifically with Courageous Ascension as your conduit slot. This is mostly because, Kyrian cannot effectively use Shadow Flame Prism to the top of its ability during its kind of Void Form ramp with Boon of the Ascended. You just have too many other things to do. So you can't effectively use Shadow Flame Prism. Because of that, you do use Talbotar's Stratagem to still get some benefit, generically speaking. Now, the other kind of caveat here where you would not use Shadow Flame Prism is Necrolord single target as well. This is where you would use Pallid Command Legendary, which I believe comes in at like Renown 48, 49. You should get it pretty early in your Mythic progression. It's probably going to be like week 2 of Mythic Prog. You'll get that. And with Pallid Command, you will use Mind Devourer as that third conduit slot instead. So, again, with all these legendaries, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to recraft most of these, even if you already have them. So, for a quick kind of cheat sheet, the reason we're doing this is because of the new system coming in the patch, which is Domination Sockets. Effectively meaning that in the raid, certain slots are special, and you don't want a legendary slot to take away from that slot, because then you lose out on extra effects. Effectively, it's kind of like a tier set. So your kind of go-to slot for each of the legendaries kind of go along as followed. Shadow Flame Prism you want to craft in the hand slot. Pallid Command is going to be in the feet slot. You could also do it in a ring. It is just slightly behind in kind of like a BiS setup, but feet or ring, either one is okay. Talbotar's Stratagem you want to craft in the leg slot specifically. That's because the way slot is unfortunately taken from with the Domination slot. And then Twins of the Sun Priestess you want to recraft in the neck slot. Now obviously, when I didn't really talk about when to use Twins. The kind of caveat still plays in for Twins. If your group really needs the extra power infusion more so than your extra legendary, you can run it. Although I think cases where that'll make sense will be even smaller than they were in Castle Nathria. If you didn't use Twins in Castle Nathria, you probably won't use it in Sanctum of Domination. I myself used it on like a handful of fights from a progression standpoint. Most of that was pre-Shadow Flame Prism. Now that we have that, I think the gap is far too wide to make it make sense. But if you have extra Soul Ash, you feel free to craft that on the next slot. Okay, so next up we're going to cover talents real quick for the kind of generic raid build and Mythic Plus build. Okay, so generally speaking, there's no changes to our talents. Simply put, we're going to be using Mindbender and Auspicious Spirits virtually in all cases, which were kind of the up-in-the-air talents in the last tier. Mindbender is that kind of lock-in option specifically because of Shadow Flame Prism. Now, of course, if you're in a case where you're not using Shadow Flame Prism, you should go back to using Void Torrent. So specifically with Pallid Command or Kyrian, if you're using Talbotars, things like that, go back to Void Torrent. Otherwise, Mindbender is going to be your lock-in choice for everything. Auspicious Spirits as well. We were already kind of using this for every scenario instead of Shadow Crash, especially from a raid perspective. This is going to get even kind of more locked in with extra ranks of the Haunting Apparition Conduit, so keep that in mind. Now, kind of going one by one here. So from a raid build perspective, you're looking at the standard of being Fortress of the Mind, Body and Soul. You can take Intangibility if you need for specific things, but mostly Body and Soul. Twist of Fate or Misery. This is still the kind of main choice from a rating perspective. Do you want the extra execute damage or, snipe damage from low health adds? Or do you need extra help dotting lots of targets? So Twist of Fate, Misery will still be a big choice in the next raid. A lot of the fights are mostly single target with adds coming in throughout, so you kind of have to make a choice. Do you want the extra execute or Misery? Last Word or Psychic Horror. Again, kind of a personal choice here depending on what your team needs. Auspicious Spirits is that lock-in option. Mindbender with Shadow Flame Prism only, otherwise Void Torrent. And last but not least, Hungering Void. Again, unfortunately, with the kind of place the raid is in, Surrender to Madness is going to be so very, very special use cases to use. I think for consistency, you'll still want to use Hungering Void for most things. Now, when we get to the Mythic Plus side of things, things look a bit more similar than they have in the past. So again, you're still going to rock Death and Madness promote things. You can run Fortress of the Mind if it makes sense for your group, if you need it. Tyrannical, whatever it is. Body and Soul is pretty much a lock-in option here. Misery or Searing Nightmare, depending on what you need. Do you need the spread target damage? Do you need the stacked cleave with Searing Nightmare? Last Word or Psychic Horror, both good options. Auspicious Spirits or Shadow Crash. Again, this is going to come down to kind of personal preference. You're going to see more consistent options with AS the higher the key gets. Shadow Crash is going to be kind of weird. Again, Shadow Crash is only as good as the person casting it. If you miss a Shadow Crash, it sucks. So obviously AS can't miss unless the target dies. So larger preference there this tier, especially with more Haunting Apparition ranks. Mindbender or Void Torrent in Mythic Plus, again, kind of your choice. If you are using Shadow Flame Prism, again, Mindbender is the lock-in option here. Shadow Flame Prism, still a great option. Legendary for Mythic Plus. You always want to use Mindbender with that. And the last year, you could run Ancient Madness here, or overwhelmingly, you will probably use Hungering Void, again, for their consistency. And with the gear levels that we're getting, you're able to get kind of sustained very long Void forms. It's effectively like you always had Surrender to Madness anyways. So Hungering Void is kind of outscaling Surrender as far as that goes. But again, feel free to take Ancient Madness if you're kind of doing bigger pulls less often. You get that kind of big burst of crit that can be a very, very big deal, especially with all the other things we're getting in the patch. So, okay, that is talents. Real quick, I'm going to cover our stat priority. Again, similar to talents, really no changes in patch 9.1. You still kind of want to get as much haste and mastery as possible. Ideally, keeping them like kind of somewhat equal from an item stat budget. But again, unfortunately, due to poor stats on Sanctum of Domination gear, you'll likely have more versatility than you'd like just to get those Domination Sockets. It seems like that was kind of the trade-off. If you want a Domination Socket, here's some versatility. I think in like the BiS gear set, there's like 11 or 12% verse, unfortunately. So you're going to do your best here to get haste and mastery. I have a feeling heroic gear is going to feel kind of crappy because of this. By the time you get kind of mythic full BiS, you get back to that 30% haste mark, you'll be okay. But again, you're going to kind of have to play it by ear and as far as that goes. After haste and mastery, generally speaking, then you would want kind of intellect next, and then kind of crit and verse as kind of the lowest bucket of stats that you would like. So again, no real changes here. Really the problem becomes with an itemization perspective, and we'll cover that with the kind of BiS list here in just a second. But real quick, before we get to the kind of BiS list, let's cover gems, enchants, consumables, all that stuff. All right, so as far as gems, all these consumables go, you're basically going to continue doing this the same as you had in the opening patch. You want to use those gems to fill out haste, mastery, typically whichever one you're lacking more of. Just make sure you don't tank either one of them too much. And when I say tank, like if you're sitting there like sub 20% haste especially, you probably need haste. Otherwise, this spec's going to feel pretty terrible. And you'll probably do worse too. Enchants, again, likely staying the same. I'll put up this just in case you didn't see it. The kind of big ones to kind of note here, just because this was a little fuzzy. From a chest enchant perspective, you probably want to go with Eternal Stats just for, you get extra health from it. It's more consistent. Eternal Insight is fine. It does have a higher DPS, max DPS potential. But again, it's a proc-based effect, so take that as you will. Weapon enchants, somewhat similar to the last tier. You can rock Sinful Revelation for that single target specifically. However, generally speaking, Celestial Guidance makes a bit more sense. One, it's cheaper and it's more versatile in terms of what it's good at, but for a fight where you're like, man, I really need that single target damage, like a Sludge Fist type encounter, you could swap to Sinful on Progression if you really need that extra kick in damage. Consumables are also remaining the same, so you still want your Spectral Flask of Power, the Spectral Intellect Potion. You could use the other ones, but I think Int Potions are just generally more consistent for progression especially. Now that we have more gear, they've just gotten significantly better. From a food perspective, you still want to be using Feast, and Haste or Mastery food if you ever do not have a Feast is fine. And then Shadow Core Oil for your weapon oil is the kind of the last thing there. Now, the last kind of consumable that I wanted to cover in this section is Domination Socket pieces from Sanctum of Domination. So I will say, Sims are still pretty early for this stuff, so keep an eye on the Sim website for this. I'll kind of show you what it's looking like right now, but again, this could change as we get more data and get more testing. These effects have been particularly buggy in terms of, if they say everything should proc it, well, it's not procking consistently, so we've had some trouble here from an implementation standpoint to really understand how it's working in game. But from an ideal perspective, if everything was working correctly, you do want to prioritize the Unholy set bonus is really what you want. So the kind of order to get things in, if we're talking about like, hey, you're acquiring like one or a couple pieces at a time, you want to slot the Shard of Diz first, and then if you have 2 slots available, you'll go Shard of Diz and Shard of Beck. Once you get 3 sockets, you actually want to resocket your stuff and get the Unholy set bonus, which means you have 1 DPS throughput and 2 non-DPS ones to get that Unholy set bonus activated. Now, the caveat there, to get these set bonuses activated, you need the specific piece that comes with them. I believe for the Unholy set bonus, that requires the helm specifically. So keep that in mind. You do need the helm from Sylvanas, ideally, to get this bonus. You can use the other helm as well. It's just slightly worse than the Sylvanas one. And then the 4th and 5th domination slots that you get will be the extra shards that you weren't using, which is Shard of Beck, and then lastly, Shard of Core. So the sim charts in the website and the sim website will be updated as we get more data for this, but just know this is kind of our rough order for now. Now, speaking of gear, I'll show you the BiS list real quick. It's going to look a little different than Castle Nathria for sure, in that raid pieces are a bit less prevalent now, and that's for a couple of reasons. So the first one is, the stats just are terrible. Unfortunately, we can't go for getting too low of haste, but we still want that extra main stat, especially from the last 2 bosses being Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas. Drop the higher item level. We always like more item level, generally speaking, even if it's not our ideal stats. So yes, generally speaking, you do want the Sylvanas helm here. I know the stats are worse than the other helm, but because of the extra item level, the extra stat budget, it does barely inch out. You're talking about like 0.2%, but it is technically better. If you have bad options in the other slots, your haste is really low, you can use the other helm, but keep that in mind. From the neck perspective, a lot of you guys should be using the passively forged credentials neck that you get from unlocking hard mode of the new Tazavesh dungeon. You get it like pretty much for free. It's a great option to kind of tide you over until you get probably the mythic Kel'Thuzad neck, although it kind of depends on timing and kind of what you need gear wise. A lot of you are going to use this neck until you get the mythic version. It's about equal to the heroic version, maybe slightly worse just because of the proc, even though it is kind of lower eye level, but again, keep that in mind, the proc is quite valuable still. Shoulder piece, we're using the domination slot as of everything else. Cloak, ideally you're using the cloak from the Spires of Ascension dungeon. It's not, that much better, but it does give us a bit better stat allocation, so we do like that cloak better than the one from the raid, so you can try getting that from Mythic Plus, or ideally your vault. Chest domination slot, wrist domination slot, gloves. If you're not using Shadowflame Prism, you can use Grasp with the Clairvoyant Sage. Otherwise, this is the slot you would craft Shadowflame Prism in. Belt domination slot, that's our last one here. Legs also comes from Mythic Plus, so you'll have to do Mythic Plus for that. You can get the alternate legs, but again, Mythic Plus legs are slightly better. We also have our boots from the raid, which is fine, and one of our rings comes from the raid. The second ring from the raid is okay. Ideally, again, you're going back into the other side for Death God Signet, so you have 2 the other side Mythic Plus pieces, ideally. And then trinkets are going to be kind of the other weird one. Soul Lighting Ruby is still your overwhelming BiS trinket you want to use for pretty much everything. Curing, you could also use Imperial Ordnance as well to sneak up with the boon timing. And then for most of us, our second trinket right now is Tome of Insight, which you've probably seen in the Discord if you haven't already. It is a kind of a Korthia random drop. It can come from rares, the BOA token, all kinds of things. Right now you can only upgrade it to 220. At higher levels of renown you can upgrade it to 233. This trinket is insane. It is up like 60 to 80% of the time. Very, very strong amount of crit. I expect this might get tuned differently. They either might nerf the trinket or buff our other raid trinkets. Right now the raid trinkets are not that strong. In fact, if you still have a Side Denathrius Mythic Cabal's Hymnal trinket, that will probably still tide you over until Mythic trinkets from the new raid. It is still very competitive. So, you know, who knows what they'll do with this. Just keep an eye on the Discord. If it does get nerfed, we'll probably end up using the Forbidden Necromantic Tome from Kel'Thuzad as our second trinket, and the weapon is also from Kel'Thuzad. So again, that's kind of our overview from the BiS list. So again, like I mentioned, the list is not including the legendary items, so you'll have to fill in those appropriate based on what you're using. And that's really all I have from this. Keep in mind with Mythic Plus here, you have 4 slots that you want for Mythic Plus: the Cloak, Legs, Ring, and Trinket. All of those beside the Cloak are almost required because we need the stats. And then we'll see about Tome of Insight, so keep in mind for that. All right, so that is our gear. Again, keep an eye on the Icy Veins guide for any changes in that, or the Discord for kind of regular updates. All right, before I end this video, a couple other things I want to hit up before we close out. So first off, rotational changes. Nothing's really changing as far as that's concerned. I have made a bit of kind of extra clarification in the Icy Veins guide to kind of help you through that. So be sure to check that out if you were at all confused with the existing rotation. But in general, nothing is changing there. Now, you'll notice the things I'm not covering here are specifically a lot of Mythic Plus stuff, and as well as specific raid boss tips for Sanctum of Domination. These will be coming. The written guides should be out by Tuesday, so you can check that out on Icy Veins for kind of, very kind of overview stuff you need for the raid, like talent suggestions, that kind of thing. And then as the kind of season progresses, things get kind of more set in stone. We get more experience. We see what the actual raid bosses are like compared to testing. Those videos will come out kind of after that. Things kind of solidify. But that is it for this video, folks. Big thank you to all the people supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it, especially after the last few months. I know there's not been a lot of videos. There's been a lot of sims to run, a lot of feedback to give. And just in general, the 9.1 patch cycle has been kind of crazy, both in real life and in game. So again, look for the full guide series in the coming weeks, where I'll kind of break down each of the categories I did into a specific dedicated video. This is really just meant to give you that kind of brief overview that you need to survive the kind of launch of the patch, in kind of addition to the written guide that's on Icy Veins or any of the resources we have in the Priest Discord. So again, big thanks to everyone for watching, and we will see you in the next video. See ya.